Hello, I'm A.M. Justice, and this is a chapter called Latent Potential from my novel A Wizard's Sacrifice, the second volume in the Woern Saga, a dark science fantasy. I know people usually read the first chapter of their series, but I like to buck the system, and I've chosen something from later in the story, because it shows the unique aspects of my magic system, which is based on a parasite that gives people telekinetic powers. I hope what you hear today piques your interest in the series. Latent Potential. Rotten eggs jammed Fabian's nostrils, the stink wedging deep in his sinuses. Mucus gummed his eyelashes and sweat streamed like tears. Mopping his face with a stained sleeve, he sucked in another choking breath. He could spare no Woern for cooling skin or clearing eyes. Every jewel went into the bubbling, sulphurous mud in the channel below. Around the perimeter of the camp, the earth heaved and steamed as the council dug deep, crushing sulfur into basalt, hammering through rhyolite hard as granite, drilling vents down into magma. Siphoning lava into the perimeter ditch had been Victoria's mad idea. After the last Cragnashian attack, not a single wizard argued against it. And here they were, six at a spell, barbecuing themselves over a pit. Yet, the plan seemed to be working. On the first day, when they'd barely begun the work, a force of Cragnashians had come as far as the tree line and halted. Horns had blown, troops had assembled, but the stink of sulfur was already thick enough to drive the creatures back into the forest. 6 days later, camps had been rebuilt and troops rested and restored. The hospital staff had washed linens and rolled bandages, farriers made new supplies of arrows and spears, and the artillery crews had restocked their stores of stone and obsidian. But the council was worn to a frazzle. Selbineth no longer worked on the moat, saving her Woern to restore the others, and even she was weary and spent. Shrine, his nerves sizzled, a shiver twisted his spine, mucus clogged his throat, his temples pounded. Grunting, he ignored the hammering and poured energy into the mud. His lungs ached, stuffed with mucus thick as wool. Coughing, he drove Woern at the earth. Below, a bubble oozed to the surface and popped, spray hissing on charred grass lining the channel. "Ho, Fabian!" Victoria flew up to his side. "You look like shit." Bile churning, his gaze slid from her swollen belly to her ankle, splinted and tightly bandaged. One day, the council would have to confront the hypocrisy of permitting her to fight alongside them while she committed the very crime that had brought Milnera into this world. But that day would not be today, or soon. "I feel worse than I look," he replied. A hard laugh cut the air. "I've said the same more times than I can count." Her mouth softened. "And how many times have you told me, 'Don't do too much, only enough'? You're violating your own rules, sir. Let me take over. Your shift begins in 2 hours. You should rest while you can." She raised an eyebrow. "If you don't rest, you'll be taking a dip in that scalding mud beneath us." He glanced at her belly again. "The vapors here cannot be good for the babe." A hand stroking her abdomen, she grinned proudly. "Look what I've learned to do, master." A shimmering membrane formed around her head, and an iridescent hose snaked toward the forest and fresh air. His eyebrows rose. "You can maintain that while you dig?" Her waveform surged toward the rocky sludge, turning it over like cake batter. "I set it just as you taught me to set light globes, so I don't have to think about it." He shook his head, chortling softly. "Madam, you may be the strongest wizard known Earth has known in quite some time." Her pride melted into a frown, and she clasped his arms. "Please, Thabian, you're our haven. Don't burn yourself out and leave us friendless here." "I have no intention of self-harm." He ceased pouring his wern into the mud, and dizziness rolled over him. His head lolled backward, and he blinked at feet firmly planted on the ground, Victoria's arm around his shoulders. "Shrine, you almost did have a very hot dunking. I'll take you to Sailbeneth." No, thank you, madam." He stepped away. "Sailbeneth is severely taxed. I'll be fine with some rest." "Well, come here at least." She palmed his cheeks and brushed her tongue against his eyelashes. Energy spurted between them, and his knees steadied, but she scowled as she released him. "You taste sick. Not just tired, but sick. You should go to Sailbeneth. Or Bethnal," she added. His eyes flashed at the tents surrounding them, but they were alone. "That, madam, is a crime, not only by council law. It was outlawed long before the council's existence as a deed no less wicked than rape or murder." Brows knit, she hissed, "She helps me all the time." "I know, madam, but you must understand a carrier such as she cannot defend herself should the wizard's need become greater than the wizard's will. Your love for your sister enables you to resist harming her, but someone who did not care for her so deeply might do so." Her mouth quirked. She patted his arm. "Well then, not worried about you. Rest up." Waveform blooming, she shot upward, and the earth boiled. Cheeks hot, he walked fast to wring the giddy feeling from his gut. He had no time or inclination for forbidden fruit. Bethnal's mien was a pleasant distraction, her conversation an engaging diversion, but affection was out of the question. Still, he regretted the rude disdain he'd shown her during the months Victoria lay ill and helpless. He'd spent that time full of anger and resentment and shame at having been ordered to play host for people who ought to have been imprisoned. Yet he'd come to welcome Victoria's courage in battle, and her strength in the Woern was undeniably useful, especially at times like these. His heart laboring, his steps slowed. Fatigue descended on him like a sledge, and the air felt thick as liquid earth as he forced one foot before the other. By the time he pushed aside the draperies covering his doorway, his muscles and bones trembled beneath the shell of his skin, and he had to use the Woern to hold himself upright. "Sir, you are ill!" Fainad rose from a table littered with open volumes. Bethnal stood too, a single finger marking her place in a book. Thabian's Woern vibrated, their need for succor driving him toward her. "Leave us, my lady," he said hoarsely. "Fainad was tutoring me in the nuances of council law," she replied, slipping a ribbon into the leaves of her book. He fought the Woern, itching for her touch. "That is well, but I must rest." "Of course, my apologies, sir." As she passed, the Woern shifted toward her like iron to a lodestone. He braced his backbone against the pull, but rigidity torqued into a rictus. Every muscle clenched at once. His head jerked back, his hands became claws, and furnishings and draperies spun. His head smashed the floor. A paper crinkles. Teeth crunch and lips smack. "It's a shame, Pip." Thabian nods, eyes glued to the furrowed brow, the hand urgently gesturing at the twisted body on the floor. "I brought her here for you to woo, brother, but you never spoke to her so far as I could tell." Dealn chuckles. "Pip, Don't lie to yourself. I know what you did and why you did it, which is why I never sought the lady's favor. Now, look at that. Fainted motions Bethnal out, but she shakes her head and points toward the camp center. After a moment's hesitation, Fainted ducks through the tent flap, and is gone. Oh, now, what's this? Dealin says. Bethnal pulls a short dagger out of her pocket. Yanking off the sheath, she slices her thumbs. Oh, Dealin teases. She likes you too. Fabian's gut clenches in terror as Bethnal kneels beside his body. Wet heat stung his eyes. Fire flooded past his eyelashes, seeped through his tear ducts into his sinuses. His spine relaxed, arms flopped still. No. The word formed in his mind, but he lay prone, his muscles released from contraction, but heavy as lead. Stop, he begged, but the blood, her blood, ran down the sides of his face into his ears, while the protest bloomed and popped like the molten earth. No, stop, he said, trying to remember how to translate thought into speech. No, stop, he said silently, hunting for that clarity of purpose that would permit her to hear him. No, he mumbled aloud, his tongue and lips finally obeying. Gentle fingers pressed his skull, her thumbs still nestled into the hollows around his eyes. He strained to lift his hands and move hers aside. Stop, please. Is that enough? She asked. Yes. Swallowing a groan, he pushed himself up and clasped her hands. Thriving Woern pulsed along his nerves as he probed her wounds, drew the tissues together, and knitted the skin closed. Thank you. He pressed her hands between his. Don't ever do that again. Her brows drew together. Why? He closed his eyes and expelled a breath. Woern fizzled between them. The hairs on their forearms stood straight as grass, ripples echoing each other's motions. Each moment he grew stronger, more hale, but touching her, he only wanted more. It's too much a temptation. Fabian, I'm glad to see you well, Selbineth said. Your steward interrupted a private conference, Nelkior drawled, entering on the council leader's heels. Elisender, is that blood? All eyes looked at the red smears staining her skirt and his face, and Fainted snatched a towel from a cupboard and tossed it to him. I had a seizure and bit my tongue, Fabian said, mopping his cheeks. Lady Bethnal was kind enough to pillow my head until the fit passed. Standing, he handed her up. Thank you, my lady. Who'd have guessed Fabian's mouth would contain something sharper than his tongue? Nelkior raked his eyes over Bethnal. How fortunate you were on hand, my dear. Sheath your wit, sir, Selbineth said. You were retching into my commode not half an hour ago. I thank Elisender Fabian recovered as quickly without my help as I have few Woern to spare these days. My lady, how are your studies progressing? Well, madam, Selbineth nodded. Good. Fabian, rest. I saw that Victoria has taken your place, but we must keep a close eye and be sure she does not overtax herself as well. Nelkior, let us return to my pavilion so we may resume your restoration. They left, and Fabian stared after them, blood boiling at Nelkior's temerity. I'll let you rest, Bethnal bowed over an armload of books. He expelled a breath and relaxed his scowl. Thank you again. She paused at the threshold. What do you mean? It's too tempting. A tightness seized his throat as he met her soft brown eyes. You possess the gift of life, but it is a forbidden treasure, both for you to have and for wizards to use. In the purge, They killed latents like me, didn't they? They did. It was a horror, but a necessary one to prevent the Woern plague from spreading across the world once more. They had no other option? At the time, they felt they did not. Swallowing, she looked at the books in her arms. I understand. When she met his eyes again, hers were haunted. Sometimes the only way to stop one horror is to commit another. Rest well. I hope you enjoyed this reading, and please check out the other readings in the Glasgow 2024 Indie Reading Library, as well as our virtual panels and other online programming leading up to the live WorldCon in Glasgow in August of 2024.